Venezuela remains at the center of a prolonged political and humanitarian crisis shaped by years of economic collapse, institutional erosion, and sustained repression. Recent developments have intensified uncertainty rather than resolved it, raising urgent questions about sovereignty, accountability, and the future of democratic governance. From our side, from our perspective, the priority is now separating what the facts are from the narratives that are part of the warfare on social media, on the mainstream media, and overall what the political spectrum of both sides are saying about Venezuela, while keeping the humanitarian impact firmly in view. I'm Kai Salamdar, founder of Intel Focus, and I'm joined with my colleague Ani Linden. We will be unpacking a lot of questions and we will answer a lot of questions about Venezuela and the situation that unfolded to the downfall of Nicolas Maduro. I'm very glad to say that we are not just giving our opinions on this matter, but we're joined by someone who has witnessed and experienced living under Nicolas Maduro's reign in Venezuela. We don't use her real name, but as synonymous to protect her identity. As we know, even Maduro is in the US with his wife, but the Maduro government continues, his policies continue, and the crackdown on dissent continues. We're joined by Fernanda. Fernanda, we would be very glad to hear from you what's happening in Venezuela. What was your experience growing up in Venezuela, and why uh, b- this incident led to the downfall of Nicolas Maduro?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. Today is really important for every Venezuelan, not only in Venezuela, but every Venezuelan in the world to be heard and to have their feelings validated in this very complex and difficult times. So, of course, like for everyone, when I first found out about this, it was right as it was happening in Caracas. I don't think anyone could believe it. First of all, because everything was very Hollywood like, right? Helicopters and bombings. And with AI being such a huge deal nowadays, you just have to doubt and second guess, especially after more than 20 years of having the same regime. It's very hard to believe, right? I'm going to start by saying that the first feeling was shock, uncertainty, and then it was, I have to say, a bit of happiness when the final news came out, like 6 hours later after the bombing started, and it was Maduro's arrest. However, I do have to say that this is my perspective. And I was not alone when we kind of happy, but at the same time something was off, right? Because how is it that a country just got into our country and did such a huge operation. And now this guy is arrested and it's headed to New York. First of all, you couldn't believe it because of, again, the time that they've been there and how hard it has been to express, to change government, to have basic human rights. For this to happen all of the sudden, it was hard to believe. But also, how can we be so vulnerable to have foreign military coming to our country? But I do have to say that this comes from someone that hasn't lived in the country for the past 8 years. So I think that definitely changes the perspective. But if you ask any Venezuelan today that still lives in the country, I'm sure that they are not thinking, oh my God, someone came in and stole the president. They are just thinking, oh my God, someone finally did something because we've done it all. So I can definitely understand how this is complex. The Venezuelan conflict is very, very complex as any conflict in the world, but there are a lot of elements, right? Being in Latin America, natural reserves, oil, of course, but a lot of power, drug dealing, freedom, human rights, right? There are a lot of things that come together, and there is not one way to look at it. What we've seen in the media, especially in social media, is like a very binary debate, right? You either hate it or you love it. And it's not like that. From my stance, I think you can love it and hate it at the same time, especially because of the consequences. The reason that I'm here anonymously is because The regime is still there. There is a lot of fear within Venezuelan people. There is a lot of fear to express, and that's why we haven't seen like any big expressions of joy or manifestations in the streets, because I would like to say like 90% or 99% of the government, it's still there. You can say
Right.
whatever, maybe they are under Trump's orders, right? But they are still there, and they still have the internal force of things.
Right.
Yeah. That is so well said. Thank you so much for joining. And what you said, especially about social media, considering, for example, what I've myself seen, a lot of, like you said, it's so binary. It's either left wing or right wing, and there is no nuance to the conversation. It's either this was right or wrong. And what I find interesting, especially with conversations with you, how this is people who don't know the context make statements that are quite uneducated in a way because they might not know or they chose to ignore the situation for the past 2 decades. The inflation, the nearly 8 million people who have fled the country, including yourself. It's not so simple saying like, okay, another country invaded, like the US invaded Venezuela, therefore bad. But then also with the situation that has been going on for over 2 decades, is like you said, that people felt happiness and were celebrating that we are finally free. And what it is, I think, for a listener to kind of understand the situation is that it's not so black and white as people say. Do you want to talk a bit more about that, how people might make uneducated choices, or not choices, but statements regarding the situation if they don't know the context of Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, it's been frustrating, like every conversation in social media, right? So this is an environment that is very like uh it's from your guts, right? People don't seem to think before writing. So I totally get it, but it's definitely been frustrating because I would say that from a psychological point of view, we feel like our feelings are not valid. There has to be a questioning from people, like to say, okay, why are these people happy? Why so many people is happy about this around the world? So yeah, I think it's the first word is frustrating, but then again, from my perspective, is a hypocrisy,
Hmm.
because this is nothing. We can say that there has been 2 decades, more than 2 decades of this. Of course, maybe we can argue whether Chavez started it or not. There are numbers that say that from Chavez we started to see political persecution, political imprisonment, lack of freedom, lack of human rights. But of course, with Maduro, this definitely got worse. And it seems like people are just, again, using binary thoughts to judge a situation. And from my perspective, it seems to be that, okay, if this is something that is shown as progressive or as left wing, then it's not as bad because it's part of a right wing plot, right? What they are doing, especially when you had Maduro, for example, in the past elections that he lost, but no one in the world cared about that. But in the past elections, he said to a reporter, "Free Palestine." And that video went around the world because, of course, you had a Latin American leader saying "Free Palestine" when that conflict is so huge for everyone in the world. When we have a genocide, to have that leader saying that, of course, you're going to say, okay, this guy loves us in Europe, right? Or maybe in Palestine. But with what, how are you judging that person? Why can't you say, okay, this guy is full of BS? Why is he telling these things? However, he still is a dictator. He still is violating human rights, and he ended up stealing the elections. And honestly, no one in the world seemed to care. There were diplomatic actions done within the continent. The first one going to for example, to the Organization of American States and saying, "Hey, there was an election. We are concerned about these elections. Let's do." They were trying to have a resolution saying, "Let's review the results. Let's have the government give us the ballots of this election." Everyone was either against it or they abstained to vote, including Brazil, including Colombia, who are strategic neighbors in the region, right? And they've been trying for a lot of time to have dialogues and to have somehow strategies to understand what Maduro is doing and to try to have a transition. But it seems to be they are more harsh when it's something coming from the right wing political spectrum, but when it's the left wing political spectrum, they seem to be, no, let's think about it. Maybe they are, it's not that bad. We can talk about it. But I just wonder if there was a different ideology promoted by Maduro and the regime, would we
Hmm.
have the same response?
Mhm.
It's just the
Mhm.
question that I continue to ask myself.
Right.
That is such a good point. Also, because left wing, for example, let's say in Europe or well, North America, has looked very different to left wing
Hmm.
in Latin America and vice
Correct.
versa. Kais, do
Correct.
you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think you touched upon very important aspects and points because it's also about how internationally certain ideologies are aligned, right?
Hmm.
If we go back to the why oil is a major part of this, and I would say I applaud Trump for one thing, and that's his honesty. He doesn't hide behind diplomacy. He doesn't hide behind very fancy words to avoid the real policy behind their actions as well. But when we look at Venezuelan history, it was Hugo Chavez that nationalized a lot of industries, including oil, which angered the U.S. in that time. Right, a lot of U.S. Oil companies were kicked out from Venezuela.
Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And that Hugo Chavez himself was a iconic figure in Venezuela. Venezuela was known for Hugo Chavez, at least in the recent history. But from the international observers' point of view, when Nicolas Maduro comes to power, he's not as popular as Chavez. One thing. Second,
Hmm.
he's not as power doesn't come from himself or his alignment with Hugo Chavez himself, but from his wife, because a lot of people were discussing were quite shocked. Like, why would they capture his wife, right? But apparently, Nicolas Maduro's wife was actually working for Chavez government for so long, and that's how, and she was a powerful woman back then too, and that's how they got to know each other, and then later married together. And I guess she is also a powerful figure behind Maduro's reign over the past couple of years. And the other point was that when you mentioned, oh, because Maduro showed sympathy for certain countries or for certain incidents around the world, let's say the issue in the Middle East, right? The issue of Israel and Palestine. That's the same narrative that was given when the Taliban's takeover happened to Afghanistan. A lot of these narratives, oh, the reason was because they were all anti American, right? So, this notion of anti American doesn't matter even if you're a terrorist. If you are anti American, you're being applauded by certain group of people in the world because you hate the other party so much that any group does something, you may not show complete sympathy with that, but you'll be like, as you mentioned, like, oh, let's think about it, let's discuss this further. So that's the another element. But of course, there's no
Hmm.
doubt that Maduro was an evil person, and he under his reign, the Venezuelan economy, migration, and also inflation of the currency just came so down. And one of the, I guess my question would be that what did the people think inside Venezuela over the past years? Were they able to at least voice some of these concerns inside the country? Do you remember at least maybe some certain protests happening past couple of years and how the regime treated it?
Yeah, of course. I just want to mention something about oil being nationalized.
Right.
Yes, Chavez did do like a huge deal. He basically changed the whole framework of how oil worked in Venezuela. And of course, that infuriated the United States. However, we did have a first attempt that was materialized of nationalizing oil in Venezuela, and it was in 1976 in a previous government. That was actually that president is called Carlos Andres Perez, and he was a guy that Chavez used to mention a lot in his speeches as a political rival, right? Because again, Venezuelan political context is it's a bit more complex than that, but I
Hmm.
did want to mention that because oftentimes we see as Hugo Chavez government as the first one that did X and Y and Z in Venezuela. And it is important to have those facts that I understand that maybe not everyone has it, right?
I think it's a very important aspect
Yeah.
you pointed out. Yes. Yeah.
Yep. And about Celia Flores, yes, she was a very powerful and influential figure in political context in Venezuela. She was attorney general for a lot of time during Chavez's president, and then she was a National Assembly deputy, and she was the president as well of the National Assembly. So under her wing, there was a lot of laws and things that they were able to turn into legal things to justify actions from Chavez and, of course, later on Maduro. Regarding your questions about the protests, yes, we've had a ton under Maduro's presidency. I think the first one that comes to mind was 2014. Of course, a year later that Chavez passed away, this was a protest that pretty much focused on, well, we started to see a lot of lack of resources in supermarkets in Venezuela, no medicines. And for example, I can tell you that one time I had an extreme infection in my hands because of dermatitis, and I didn't have antibiotics to heal my hands. So I had to run around the city to basically find where could I find antibiotics, something as simple as an ointment, right? So it's just an example of what was the context back then. Everyone was like, no one even cared if it was Chavez, Maduro, or anything. People couldn't eat. People were dying in the hospitals. That was the first big protest. And that, of course, was next to a movement from the opposition called La Salida, meaning kind of like the exit, right? The movement was promoting Maduro's regime out of the country because of this economic and social crisis. So in
Right.
those protests, going out in the streets to protest was very, I would say, frightening, because even though it was the biggest protest that I've seen after so many years in the country, there was a lot of people in the streets. No one was afraid to go out. It was the one of the worst, how can I say this, attacks, I have to say, from the national security enforcement, from the government to the people. And not only from military, National Guard, police, but also parallel circles, armed circles, and crime organizations that were pretty much paid by, I cannot say a name, but definitely they were being financed by people in power to have to institute fear in people. So that's when we started to see people dying because of a gun pointed out directly at them, tear gas all over the place. I mean, using all of the political or all of the security forces to just people protesting. I think 2014 was that huge, or that first crackdown of Venezuela's normality, I should have to
Mhm.
say, in Maduro's government. Of course, after that, when people started to see how many people die, how many people were imprisoned, that today they are still in prison and we are already in 2026. Of course, people got scared. I think the
Mhm.
next round of protests was around 2017,
Wow.
which I think, in my experience, or huge protests, I have to say. And in my experience, the period of 2017 and 2018 was one of the worst when it comes to economic and social political crisis. And it matches with the migration numbers from Venezuela to pretty much around the world. And that's where we started to see people walking out of Venezuela. Literally, they were walking to go to Colombia, to go to Ecuador, and furthermore to go to the south of the continent.
Right, right. And on what you mentioned, I've seen also a lot of arguments saying that
Hmm.
it was also due to mainly sanctions and foreign pressure and Venezuela, that Venezuela wasn't able to be as connected as it should have been. What is your take on that? How much sanctions did cripple the Venezuelan healthcare system, let's say, social systems, economic system, but also its connectivity from the rest of the Latin American countries?
Yeah, that's a hot topic. Sanctions definitely make all around the world. We see Cuba, we see, of course, in Venezuela. It definitely it affects at the end of the day people, right? Not necessarily the government. But if I'm not wrong, if I get my facts straight, the first round of sanctions was 2017. And I mentioned the first big round of protests was 2014 in Maduro's regime. So of course, I do think that sanctions made things worse, but it wasn't the root cause of the situation in the country, because the government in Chavez, during Chavez government and later on Maduro, because he continued that, the government took over the industry. They basically destroyed a lot of companies that, yes, they were private companies, but they were working just fine to provide enough food and supplies for the people, using that reasoning of, yes, we need to save our industry and we need to give everything to the people. They pretty much turned those companies quite weak and made it even impossible to have any sort of business in Venezuela to supplies. Again, in 2017, we saw the sanctions, but we have the crisis in Venezuela long before that. And if I don't recall correctly, the main sanctions at that time was also directed to people within the government, right? It was around that time where we started to see some accusations of drug dealing, some accusations of money laundering, etc. Maybe not from the main folks in the government, but relatives related to them. For example, Celia Flores, Maduro's wife's nephews,
Hmm.
they were accused of those type of crimes, right? So you kind of start to see like the tentacles of how bad
Mm.
it was at that time.
Yeah, I think where you mention 2014, this is also the year that always keeps popping up in any sort of like numbers. For example, Foro Penal, that is
Hmm.
an organization for listeners who don't know what Foro Penal is. They are an organization that offer legal assistance pro bono to people who are subjected to arbitrary detentions and their relatives. So since 2014, Foro Penal have reported that there have been nearly 19,000 arbitrary detentions since 2014. So it appears that all the numbers that they use, they all start from 2014. Like it is clear that this is the year where things started to crack down and then further exacerbated in 2017. But yeah, these, going back to Foro Penal, these
Hmm.
are numbers um, from 2014 until 2025. Of course, we don't know what the numbers are now, but yes, as I said, 19,000 arbitrary detentions, sorry, and then 10,000 plus are still subjected to restrictions of freedom in Venezuela, and these are just numbers that we know of. Like, of course, it's difficult to find the real number of this, but yeah, I just wanted to add that because 2014 seems to be that kind of like when things started going downhill. And I wanted to give a shout out to Foro Penal for their incredible work in the country as well.
Yeah, given the lack of information, and that's another key part of this whole conflict, right? We don't have official numbers of pretty much anything. Every source of data that we can find on the internet is from independent media that take a huge risk in documenting this and in publishing papers and articles and pretty much documenting history, what maybe in 20 or 30 years we'll see in the future as the actual numbers, because of course the regime is not going to give actual numbers and they are not going to say, yes, we had an increase in protest against us in this X year or whatever. So that's a great source, Annie. Thank you for mentioning it, because
Mm.
the work that they do, they exist ever since I can't even remember things in Venezuela, just supporting political imprisonment and this huge topic in the country.
Yeah, yeah, for
Absolutely.
sure.
I want to also touch upon your thoughts and generally all the Venezuelans and their thoughts towards America and how
Mm.
this incident unfolded of how they captured Nicolas Maduro. Because somehow this was coming. This was coming. The momentum was building up. And it's quite interesting that I just saw in New York, in the New York federal court, also, correct me if I'm wrong, exactly. I'm not very well versed with the judicial system, but he was not pleaded guilty for the drug charges and narcoterrorism, which is quite interesting. And then today I read somewhere that actually it wasn't Maduro himself overseeing all the drug trafficking to the US, but elements of his regime, actually. There were some elements, people within his regime that were actually part of the narcoterrorism or somehow drug smuggling to Northern America, which is the US or Canada. How much do you think this could be true, or it was all a setup to just take out Maduro for that? For
I think that I don't think he was personally, a thug, right? A drug dealing guy. I think he was definitely somewhat a figure that Chavez appointed, and then 15 years later, he's like, oh my God, I'm still here. I don't know what else to do.
Mhm.
Regarding the charges, it's an interesting topic because I'm going to give you my point of view from a Venezuelan. I don't think he's guilty of those charges. I don't
Oh,
think so, and so it makes sense that he's pleading not guilty. Definitely elements of his government are part of that. So maybe you can judge him by omission, right? Maybe of course he definitely knows, but I don't think he's the real head of that. And I do
Mm.
have to say, Venezuela's history is not a drug dealing history. Our
exactly.
country has been a bridge in Latin America to for drug transportation. That's a known fact. For organized crimes, something you can definitely talk about Venezuela is that, especially after during Chavez government and Maduro's, we've been safekeeping paramilitary groups, especially from Colombia, in Venezuela. I mean, they've been able to go and live freely around there. But Venezuela's history, again, is not a drug dealing history. So this whole situation, it's at the end of the day, it's definitely frustrating because if you ask me, and if you ask any Venezuelan, we would like to see Maduro in prison. Yes, of course,
Mhm.
handcuffed and going through that. But
Mhm.
we would like to see him going through violation of human rights, for
Yes.
corruption, for the omission of having people within his government doing atrocities to the people. However, it is what it is, and sadly, seems that Venezuela and Venezuela, it's just part of the narrative of probably the United States to have a justification to come in, right? To come in the
Absolutely.
Right.
continent. And I think that's
Absolutely.
the saddest part because at the end of the day, we don't have a solution. We are victims as a country of this. And it seems that the savior of Venezuela is like the worst guy ever. And having that feeling is definitely a terrible one. But I do have to say, when I read the charges initially, I was like, it doesn't make any sense. I'd
Mhm.
like to see him go into the Hague and just go through trials similar to after the Holocaust in the world. I would like to see that because
Mhm.
the numbers are horrific. More than
Mhm.
30,000 people killed by the government in a mysterious way throughout these years. More than 20,000 people imprisoned ever since the beginning of the protest, even before 2014. So the numbers are there, but it's a different type of crime. That's
Mhm.
that's my
Yeah.
view on that.
Mhm. That's so well said. It's exactly, I'm just here nodding like, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because my theory is that like, of course, I think we should have, like what you said, he should be sent to The Hague. He should
Mhm,
be charged with plethora of different crimes other than drugs. Because I agree with you. I doubt that I mean, yes, he was the head of state, so he's
mhm,
responsible for things, but that's more crimes against humanity, against his population, violations of human rights. And the drug stuff, I think it was a strategic way from the US to frame it that way because they have been building this narrative since September with bombing these alleged drug traffickers the boats saying that they're trafficking drugs to the US, and therefore the head of state is responsible for this. So they've been constructing this narrative since September, and this was the legal way of bringing him to New York. But I absolutely agree that that the charges should be different for the actual crimes against the people of Venezuela, that he should be held responsible before an independent court. Kais, do you have anything to add?
Well, it actually touches upon a very important aspect of the Trump's administration, if you look at it closely, because if they brought Maduro for the human rights violation charges, for repression, for cracking down on dissent, then that would align with the universal jurisdiction and of International Court of Justice, right? Or similar mechanisms, which the Trump administration is not interested. And during the Trump's presidency, he withdrew from so many international organizations, including many United Nations bodies that were more humanitarian, more aid related, or more justice related, or more in the areas of human rights. He's not interested to bring in someone like Maduro. Oh, you've been cracking down on your people and you're abusing their rights and so on. So I'm judging you based on that. No. Another aspect is that we no longer see that universal jurisdiction, at least during the Trump's administration for the next couple of years as well. Anything that will happen, it will only and solely will happen based on what he wants and based on the national security strategy they developed the last year in 2025, that particularly the Western Hemisphere, especially Latin America, is completely designated as a core area of U.S. national interests, which means that the document that was released explicitly frames, it's not vague, it's very clearly said it's that the region is part of the United States sphere of influence. That's a big thing, meaning that, okay, whatever happens here, we are sitting there and we say yes to it or we say no to it, which means also to prevent all the actors that United States seems as hostile foreign incursions or ownership, for instance, of the key assets, right, by non-Latin American countries or non-hemispheric powers, right? Which means, in this case, Venezuela was also close with Iran, with Russia, and that was against this strategy. It was a threat to this strategy. So I guess after the national security strategy was published, I guess they implemented it on Venezuela first. Venezuela was the subject or prototype of that national security strategy. I may be wrong, but it seems more like it, because now Colombia and Cuba are under radar, right? Greenland is under radar. Of course, Greenland is a bit different. I cannot compare it with this part of the world, but yeah, Colombia and Cuba. It's also interesting. Maybe, Fernanda, could you touch upon the Cuban militias that were actually providing security for Maduro? It's very interesting. I read that actually the defense minister, he said many of these Cuban militias were killed during the U.S. Delta Force raid and Caracas, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's an interesting topic. There's ever since Chavez government, it has been talked about how Cubans are basically part of Venezuela. And yes, there were some economic deals of bringing Cuban doctors to Venezuela in exchange of oil, for example. I do remember that. I remember being taken care of by Cuban doctors. I remember going there to a clinic center, and people, I mean, the people in the streets receive it like, okay, this is weird. There was never a mistreatment towards them, but it was like, why is this happening? But there was always the theory that we had military from Cuba in our political forces. And again, that was never a hot topic. Why? From my perspective, is because we were on the same left wing, spectrum. So it's okay. It's okay to have Cuban military. But I was actually surprised and to see when I saw some of the non-official numbers, because this is again by independent media. We don't have still official numbers from the regime on the day that Maduro was taken, but we have 32 Cuban militaries died, and Cuban government expressed their condolences and rejected this. So it's interesting. Why do we need a Cuban military protecting the president of a sovereign country now that sovereignty is a very hot topic today, right? It's
Mm.
that just tells that it's those were not rumors about them being in the forces. It shows that if the president of the country is trusting their security to almost over 30 Cuban military instead of maybe Venezuelans, or in addition to Venezuelans, that has to show that there was definitely Cuban intervention, not only today or that day that Maduro got extracted or whatever you want to call it, but always, because it means I mean, that's the biggest circle of trust and security, right? The security of the president. So for me, it's just a confirmation of things that we've known for years, and it's Cuban intervention.
Mm.
Right, right. It's quite still. I think the Venezuelan history, geopolitics, and its internal dynamics is it's not very clear to so many people around the world, because when it comes to Latin America, they just know a few topics and headlines that they know, right? But I know there's so much. I guess this topic needs a lot of unpacking. If you see it so, what do you think?
Mm.
What is the legal aspect of the US saying we will run the country? We will run the country. We captured, or somehow they, of course, use different terms. We kidnap the president or capture the president. How much of it actually violate international law? That's another aspect. And Fernanda, I would also pose a question for you, and that would be, what do you think of that as someone from that country? What will happen? What's the future looks like?
Okay, so to touch upon the legal perspective, so this is, at least from like what I've seen on social media and in mainstream media as well, the main concern, rightfully, by international lawyers, is that this was a violation of the UN Charter, which was the foundational treaty of the United Nations. So in the UN Charter, there is a clear prohibition of use of force against another state, which means that any aggression, often prescribed as like military force, but it can be other ways. But aggression against like another state's sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence, that is a clear no in international law, and this was clearly a violation of that. So, but Trump saying that we will run Venezuela because they don't know. I mean, this is just classic imperial way of saying that they don't know how to govern themselves, therefore we will. I mean, this is history is just repeating itself. Wasn't this it's just it's appalling from the law perspective that you would just be so brazen and just go against the prohibition of use of force. But also today, the US has withdrawn from 66 international organizations, many of which are UN organizations. So they clearly do not respect the UN order, which is also ironic because they sit in the P5. I think it's just like what I said in the beginning of the episode about the nuance and like knowing the context, but it's still, from the law perspective, it was not right and it should not have been done this way. But thinking of like Venezuela's perspective, someone did something, but it shouldn't have been done this way.
Yep. And to answer your question to how does it feel like? It's the same way as Annie mentioned, like it's the same feeling, even if we don't understand completely about international laws. When I first saw Trump's speech about, him informing what actually happened, and then there wasn't a mention of freedom. There was not a mention of democracy. There was not a mention of human rights and peace. And of course, I wasn't expecting that from him because that's not part of his usual speech. But to actually hear him say, we will take care of the country, we will take care of the oil, and it's the oil that has always belonged to us. So that for me was like the saddest, like the kind of joy that I had was immediately disappeared, because that's when I felt, okay, we're just part of this huge geopolitical board in the world. And this person, Trump, is using us as, he's just going around the world making this decision. So it feels bad. However, and again, I cannot stress this enough. If you ask a Venezuelan today, if you ask and that still lives in the country, if you ask a relative of someone that's still imprisoned in Helicoide, which is the biggest torture center in Latin America, if you ask them, how do you feel? They will say, you know what? I don't care. If they want oil, they can get it. I've never seen oil in my life. So if this means that I'll be able to see my family freely and that I'll be able to live in a way in my country out of this regime, then they can take it. Because at the end of the day, what matters the most for people is what's tangible, is their reality, is their day to day. So we can sit here and theorize about what will happen. And of course, trust me, I'm concerned about the world and about my continent, because I have a deep love for my continent, especially the South. And I understand what are the implications of this. But if you ask a Venezuelan that has lived under dictatorship for more than 20 years, they will say, well, yes, they can take it as long as we can live freely. And again, we can then theorize, okay, is it really going to be free because you will be in the hands of an empire? They don't care. And that's why you see that these people happy. I think that what people will say is that, yes, we need a democratic transition, and then we can have a different type of problems. We'd rather get rid of this problem and then deal with whatever we have to deal with. That's my take on this.
If you want to, before drawing any judgments, this is for listeners or anyone having not experienced firsthand how to, or not been able to listen to Venezuelans. The first thing they should do is don't believe anything else. Just go and listen what Venezuelans want and what they have to say. And from that, you will understand the country far better. Fernanda, thanks for joining us. And Annie, thanks for contributing. This is Intel Focus Special. Until next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.